how do we create fairness? And fairness does not mean discrimination against other people. How can we create a climate where one can feel uncomfortable and understand it's from that space of discomfort? What is it that's making me uncomfortable? What are the elements of it? And how can I understand why this is making me feel this way? Is it about me personally, or is it about the systems that are created?
Professor Wula Y. Taylor, an historian and author, professor in the Department of African American Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and Black feminist theory, and the intellectual traditions of African American women.
These systems can be the catalyst for understanding that you can have a multilingual, multiracial democracy where everyone can experience a certain kind of fairness.
Hello and welcome to Dinis Guarda YouTube podcast show. Once again, in partnership with citiesabc.com, wisdomia.ai, and businessabc.net. We continue profiling global personalities, and I'm particularly passionate about people that have, I would say, a mandate to change the world and to bring inspiration, research, and especially understanding how we can actually understand better our world, our complications, and as well the values that we need more than ever. History has been always having a lot of paradoxes, and we are probably in one of the biggest radical paradox moments in history for the good things and the less good things. But there's a lot of fantastic academic work and research that are super important. This is a podcast that is bringing personalities from the academia, from business, and from governments, and as well, especially the makers and the doers. So today I'm particularly excited to welcome to our series an academic and researcher that brings a huge importance for understanding a lot of the things we are facing in the world, and especially the research that is more important for our intellectual traditions and the legacy of a lot of different parts in terms of history and in terms of research. So I welcome to our series Professor Wula Y. Taylor, an historian and author, professor specializing in African American history and Black feminist theory and the intellectual traditions of African American women. Our research has been focused on the period of 1890 to 1980, with a strong emphasis on Black nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and the civil rights and Black Power movements. Professor Wula is an author that has multiple books. Some of the books include The Promise of Patriarchy, Women and the Nation of Islam, 2017, The Veiled Garvey, The Life and Times of Amy Jacques Garvey, 2002, Panther, A Pictorial History of the Black Panther and the Story Behind the Film, 1995, and Black California Dreaming, The Crisis of California African American Communities, and many more publications and research. Professor Wula has contributed extensively to scholarly journals all over the academic world, from the Journal of African American History to the Journal of Women History, Feminist Studies, Souls, and Afro-American, just to name a few. And she has contributed as well to academic collections such as the Obama Phenomenon, 2011, No Permanent Waves, 2010, and Telling Histories. Professor Wula earned her PhD in American history from the University of California, Santa Barbara. She's now a professor in the Department of African American Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. And her academic work has been supported by several honors and fellowship, including Ford Foundation, Minority Dissertation Fellowship, University of California Presidential Dissertation Fellowship, to name a few. So the list continues and the research is amazing. So I want to welcome, and I'm quite excited to have you here, Professor Wula.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to have the conversation with you.
So I would like to start with the so you are an expert, an historian, and as well a researcher. So let's start a bit by your history, a bit of your background, and I would say probably at the moment when you decided to go in the career academic or that you wanted to go through the role and the academy and as well your history.
Sure. I think, like many first generation undergraduate students, there were two big buckets that one tended to want to engage in when I was an undergraduate, either be a teacher or a lawyer. And for me, it was a teacher. I always wanted to be a teacher. And while a student at the University of California, Los Angeles, because I am from California, I took so many different classes. And at a certain point, the academic advisor said, you have to major in something. And so she looked over my transcripts, and I had a lot of classes in history. And she says, "Why don't you major in history? Because you have all these classes and you've done well." And I was like, "Okay, I'll major in history." So I ended up earning a degree in history. And my thinking was I would have this degree in history and I would be a wonderful K through 12 teacher. Well, during my last year of undergraduate work, I began to volunteer into classrooms, and I realized I really did not have classroom management. So my mindset was to earn a master's in history, and then I could be a middle school or high school teacher. And while I was earning the master's, the professors in the department at UC Santa Barbara said, "Why don't you apply for the PhD program?" Up until that point, I hadn't thought about earning a PhD. It was primarily a master's to be a good teacher for young people. And so I applied for the program and I was admitted. And as I put closure on my PhD in history, I knew I did not want to be in a history department. It was at that point that I knew that I wanted to be in either a Black Studies department or a Gender and Women's Studies department because the history profession and degree at that time was really not interdisciplinary. The methods were grounded in a particular way of doing the work. And I knew my thinking needed to be in a space that was more flexible. And so I applied to a job at UC Berkeley in Black Studies. It was my first job out of graduate school, and I have been there since.
Wow, that's a beautiful history and as well passing from a great university to another great one. So I want to, for people listening to us, and I think particular, of course, at the moment we are in a time where there's so much discussions around what are things, what is the right research. So I would like to touch, if you could define, and you study something really as a global expert in that area. So tell us a bit about the choice of your career and the choice of these topics. And as well for people that are, my audience is quite broader from business and technologists, but as well researchers. If you could synthesize your areas of study, I think probably for a bit broader audience before we go a bit more deep dive.
Absolutely. I think it's human nature to kind of want to know more about yourself. And for me, I wanted to know how Black people in the United States engaged outside of the white gaze. That is, how did they engage and work in organizations amongst themselves? I was also interested in how women engaged in these kinds of organizations. I think a lot of it has to do with how I grew up. I grew up in a time period where it was a transition between Jim Crow and civil rights. And so my first 4 years of schooling were in all Black schools. And then when I was in the fourth grade, there was something called busing. And I was bused to a predominantly white community. So in many ways, I had grown up in what today we would call a segregated environment. I was born in 1962. And so I had experienced that life. And then with busing, I began to be exposed to different communities and different classes of people. And so I was interested in, as I became a young adult, I wanted to go back to those moments when, you know, I went to all black schools, when, my community was very, very different. And I wanted to know, how did people experience that in times in the 1920s and the 1930s, to give me insight into who I am.
So your research specializes in African American history and Black nationalism. But let's look at the African American history from 1890 to 1980s, which is one in almost 100 years. So tell us a bit about, because there was a massive change in these 100 years, probably the biggest in the history. And as well, there was a massive impact from all the changes in society, especially in the United States, that actually reflect a lot of things happening right now, but as well in terms of the impact that this had in the world and is still having. And I know that from the 80s to now, it passed already another 45 years. I think there will be a lot of much more research to have, but I would like to touch especially how we summarize this 100 years of African American history.
Yes, it's an amazing history. It's an amazing history because there is so much change over time. For the listeners, imagine all of the change in your lifetime and then quadruple that. That is a way in which to understand those 100 years, where you go from an environment where African Americans are newly legally freed people who are fighting to exercise basic rights, rights to vote, rights of citizenship, to one where Black folks now have mobility and can move throughout the country with no restrictions. And where do they go? Where do they create home? Where do they find family? Then you go to another time period where, oh, wow, you mean we could leave the South? And you begin to see Black people moving from the rural South to southern cities, from southern cities to the North, to the Midwest. And the movement outside the South is largely because of World War I and World War II. Once the war industries open up, if you will, we see Black folks now being pulled to these industries wherein they can work in places that prior they have been discriminated against, because now these factories are seeking more workers. And they're seeking more workers because of European immigration has been halted because of World War I and World War II. So now they need Black workers. And so this is how you get a lot of Black people out of southern cities into the North. And then when it came to World War II, it opened up the West. Again, where you see during the time period of Japanese internment in the United States, they're like, oh, we could pull Black people from the South. And so, in many ways, the movement of Black people outside of the South into other parts of the countries, into other parts of the United States, is really linked to a global happening around war. And then if
So
you, oh, I'm sorry.
yeah, continue. Yeah.
I was going to say, then when you move past World War II and you get into the 1960s, right, this is a moment where the world becomes, in many ways, globally connected, I think, in ways that are new and fresh. This is a time period when you have newspapers outside of the United States reporting on the civil rights movement, reporting on what's happening in Montgomery, Alabama. And it's in many ways, this international becomes an Achilles heel to the United States. How can the United States say that they are the home of democracy when they're keeping Black people in a certain kind of space where they lack citizenship rights, where they have difficulty casting their vote? And so, in many ways, foreign policy helped to move democracy in the United States because the international community could see how Black people were being treated.
And this is super important to highlight a lot of things that have been happening, but as well, I think you only understand that if you are part of that. I think a lot of people don't understand because they don't understand, they don't have any context around that. And like you said, the communities are close. So you work extensively on Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism, two powerful movements in the history of American African identity. How do you see these movements precisely in the context that you just mentioned, the last 100 years and actually 150 years, but as well, bear in mind the research you did and how we can actually create more awareness for these movements and research at the same time and having the two things together?
That's a great question that has multiple parts. I hope I can get to all of them. I think when you look at that 100 years that you were talking about, during the period of Jim Crow, legal segregation in the United States, Black people understood the importance that they could pretty much only lean on each other. So today in 2025, we oftentimes talk about allies. But during the age of Jim Crow, the allies were very, very, very few in number. And so Black people had to organize amongst themselves to figure out how to create the world that they wanted to live in, to figure out how to create a world that was fair and that offered opportunities for themselves and their children. So during the age of Jim Crow, in many ways, there were limited options outside of working within their own communities. During the 60s, this is when we really begin to get groups that today we would call allies, wherein you had college students who were, young college students who were white at predominantly white institutions who basically went into the South in the 1960s, particularly during Freedom Summer in Mississippi, and said, we want to participate in this project called Freedom. We want to participate and understand what is it like for Black people in Mississippi? Why is it that Black people in Mississippi cannot vote? And so white students from northern campuses went to Mississippi and worked with Black students in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee organization. And they had freedom schools, Freedom Summer, where they taught math and English. And they also they taught these courses during a time period when Southern Black students didn't have summer schools, when many of them were behind in their academics. And so during the 60s, this is when we begin to have these allies, if you will, and they learn about the Black experience by taking root in those communities, living in those communities. And some of them never left. And so this is the 60s in terms of how we begin to expand the coalition of freedom speakers, the coalition of people who are willing to put their bodies on the lines for democracy, and fairness. And it's during this time that we get a lot of those iconic leaders of the movement, whether it's Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whether it's, Minister Malcolm X, whether it's Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, whether it's Miss Ella Baker, you get these iconic leaders who begin to provide a vision of what America could be if racism and discrimination were not anchored in the rule of law, in the possibilities of life.
So you touch two very important things that unfortunately are still very present, and right now they are coming probably in a more complex way because they can mix with technology, they can mix with code, with artificial intelligence. But your work spans decades and centuries of history, and from the research, and this is another broader question, but I think I have to ask. I had the privilege to meet, for instance, the Dr. Martin Luther King, and for instance, I had a fantastic experience, personal, that was speaking at the World Peace University in India, and what was very fascinating was looking at the references, of course, on on this, and of course India is right now 1.475 billion people, was the presence of Dr. Martin Luther King and a lot of these icons that you mentioned in the cultures and influence. For instance, Martin Luther King influenced himself with Gandhi, and vice versa. There was a lot of different influences. So from these icons that you mentioned and this perception, and I think the question that I'm asking is, how can we, from this research that you've been doing, what were the things that were used in society that could mitigate these major problems that you just highlighted? And you mentioned it came through icons, through allies, people that really were conscious about this. But we are in a moment that anything is possible for good and for bad. So how do you see that from historic elements to the present moments? And if there's any areas that you could summarize that you think are still like the areas probably that you felt that can be better understood to avoid a lot of the issues that happen in history.
Yes. Well, history has so many lessons for us that can be applied to this contemporary moment in terms of one, how people organized. Today, as you mentioned, there are all kind of technological ways of doing it. But back then, imagine, they had telephones, but even long distance phone calls were expensive, right? So people did a lot of letter writing. People used the newspapers to get communication out. They would say, this person is coming to town. People used the radio. A lot of times the radio and the DJs were so incredibly important to circulating information in communities. So between the radio, the newspaper, word of mouth, Sunday mornings at church where the preacher would announce who was coming to town, would announce what the goals were of certain kind of organizations. So this is how information scattered, if you will. But in the scattering of information, although that's different in 2025, I think what's not as different is how people engage once they are in community. So, for an example, once it's announced that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King is coming to town and that SCLC, his organization, along with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, are going to be in town to organize people to vote, people had to come together and decide if they wanted to participate or not. People had to come together and decide, what were the challenges of participating in the movement? What were the dangers of participating in the movement? What could happen to their families if they participated in the movement? And people had to decide if they had the bandwidth to do it. Just like today, people have to decide if they have the bandwidth to do it. But I would say one of the big differences I've noticed in terms of the history, in terms of how people organized versus how people engage today, history, particularly amongst student activists. Sometimes student activists would not be able to go to every organizing meeting. Perhaps they could only go to one a month. Perhaps they could only show up at the protests. And from history, it looks like there was a little bit more grace. That is, people would say, we're still glad to see you here. You weren't at that meeting where we were doing a lot of the grinding and the work, but we're happy to see you here. I think now, in terms of organizing, there's a little bit more critique. That is, there's not as much grace. People want people to be at every meeting, at every organizing event. And then that person might feel a level of guilt. They might feel like, gosh, I didn't do this, so maybe I shouldn't go. So I think one of the past lessons is to give ourselves more grace and understand that we can't all be the same kind of activists and have the same kind of intentional commitment as everybody else, but accept people where they are. And I think there was a little bit more room in history to accept people where they were able to participate.
Yes, I love the grace, and I think that's a very, very important thing because it's a word that I think we not. I mean, taking enough attention, because if you don't put grace in what you do, we lose the sense of respect and the sense of kindness as well. And it's very difficult because we have different cultures and different challenges as well, how we deal with even ourselves and our peers. So in your book and research, The Panther, a pictorial history of Black Panthers, you chronicled the history of the Black Panther Party. And so this was a very impactful, even in the iconography of the 20th century. And as well, we even have the Black Panther film that was taken by Marvel and pushed in another extreme. But in the other end, there's a lot of economic, and there was a blockbuster. So in one end, and for instance, interesting to look, I always like to look at research academic with mainstream. And it's interesting how that influenced so much people. For instance, I was talking with people in Middle East. It was one of the first films they saw, even in countries that had less access. So how do you see the special legacy of the Black Panther Party, and as well the ongoing conversation around social justice and activism today? We touched that before, but I would like to, from this research.
That's a great question, because the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense started in Oakland, California, where I live, began with students. And I think oftentimes we don't think about the Black Panther Party as former students, but the leaders of the organization, Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, they met at a community college, right? And so these are students who are trying to figure out, why are the police acting like an occupied force in our communities? And so they began to police the police, if you will. They began to follow the police and put them under surveillance to ensure that all the ways in which they had been brutalizing the community members would stop, or at least they would be put on watch that this is not going to happen without a witness. And so, it just began with these two young men. And eventually Bobby Hutton, who was only like 17 years old, was the third member. And I think in many ways, it's a reminder that all of these major organizations begin with one or two people visualizing a way to make freedom happen in their lives. And so they come together, they begin to police the police, because the police in many ways function as the government, function as the occupying force in the Bay Area and in other communities around the country. And so the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense is, and I'm saying the entire name of the organization because oftentimes the Black Panthers become known as the Black Panthers, and the fact that they were about self-defense as opposed to violence falls out of the conversation. They are about defending their communities. They are about defending their communities from people who are bringing harm and destruction to it. And so I became connected with this research in many ways by happenstance, if you will. I lived across the street from the community college that Huey Newton and Bobby Seale attended. And now that community college is a senior center. But back then it was a school located in the community where people could walk to. And so it was a way in which folks could take all different kinds of classes. Some of the classes would prepare them to transfer to UC Berkeley, or at that time, Cal State Hayward. But others were classes which would allow them to become efficient workers in industrializing America. So there were different things that community college offered. And it was there that they went to school, and I lived across the street from it. And one day I looked outside the window and I was like, who are all these people out there? And it was actually Mario Van Peebles, all of the people who were going to create a movie called Panther. And so they were basically in the Bay Area going to the different sites that the Black Panther Party had existed and just kind of scouting the possibilities. So me being my nosy self, I crossed the street because I didn't recognize who these people were in my neighborhood, and I found out who they were. And I looked around and I saw my friend, Tarika Lewis. And Tarika Lewis is the co-editor of the book that we wrote together on Panther and the historical Panther and the story behind the film. She's my co-author. And Tarika Lewis was the first female member to actually join the Black Panther Party. Now, there were other women who were in the party. Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale both had, Bobby Seale's wife, Artie, and Huey P. Newton, I can't remember his girlfriend's name, but they were participating by extension of the men in their lives. But Tarika Lewis was the first one to volunteer on her own. And she was there, and Tarika is the one that explained to me everything that was going on. I said, oh, wow. And so this is how I became involved, literally by looking out of my window across the street and seeing these filmmakers scouting the different properties to shoot, possibly shoot their movie and to learn more about the Black Panther Party for self-defense.
Well, that's amazing, and as well, I think there's a lot of still lack of education in the mainstream world population around these topics. And of course, I'm in London, and London is a very diverse community, and as well, there's, I think probably in the UK alone, there's a big percentage of Afro Americans. That is actually a quite significant part of the country. And as well, in my case, I have a big relationship with Africa and in the US. So, but one of the things I found out is the lack of understanding and even basic education. So you are in one of the leading universities in the world, and one of the things is, from all the work you've been contributed from scholarly journals and books, and this touch different things. So I want to touch a bit specifically about how do you see the education, not just within the Afro-American community, but in terms of general mainstream. And I know that you're a global expert in this area, but I'm particularly interested. How can we actually bring more non-controversial and more facts-driven education and research-driven to bigger audiences?
Well, I'm not quite sure how one could define controversial, because I think that sometimes what is seen as disruptive is simply fact.
No, I'm with you. I'm with you.
Okay, yes. So I think what's important is, how do we bring a history that can make people uncomfortable at times to a world that oftentimes when they are to a world that when one experiences discomfort, they become instantly on defense. How can we create a climate where one can feel uncomfortable and understand it's from that space of discomfort that one can move forward and understand, okay, what is it that's making me uncomfortable? What are the elements of it? And how can I understand why this is making me feel this way? Is it about me personally, or is it about the systems that are created to to scaffold wealth? Is it about the systems that are created that keep certain people in certain communities and outside of possibilities? And if we can understand these systems that can bring discomfort, but also systems that can be the catalyst for joy and love, and can be the catalyst for harmony within diversity. That can be the catalyst for understanding that you can have a multilingual, multiracial democracy where everyone can experience a certain kind of fairness. And so I think in many ways, this is the project of Black Studies. We are about how do we create fairness? And fairness does not mean discrimination against other people. Fairness is about creating a multilingual and multiracial democracy. Fairness is about um, creating a space where being conscious of race is not conflated with racism. And so I think for me, Black studies has been so powerful in this regard because, and I think this is why sometimes there is a defense on it, because Black studies is about creating progress for everybody. And Black studies as a discipline, right, is about exposing how students of all different backgrounds can learn about each other, can learn to respect the positives and the negatives of all of our history so that we can push for a more just democracy.
I completely subscribe, and it's more important than ever. And it's actually, I think, a continuous work because I think we sometimes take for granted these things because it's not something that we can just stop. We have always to continue educating ourselves because we have prejudice. And like you said, we have to provoke ourselves and be controversial to relearn and get into different parts. And we need stories. So coming back to stories, in your experience, how have Black women intellectual like Amy Jacques Garvey shaped both the political and cultural landscape of African American thought. And I would like to touch a bit of the history of hers because she was, of course, an iconic personality. But it's, I think, a fantastic story for young people nowadays because I think we take for granted all the things we have. But I think her story is amazing in a lot of ways, but as well, you research her in a lot of different ways, both as women intellectuals, but as well as someone that shaped political and cultural landscape.
Thank you for that question. The Life and Times of Amy Jacques Garvey was my first book. And this is a book that came out of my dissertation. So in many ways, it was my first baby, so to speak, that I spent a long time with. And Amy Jacques Garvey, for those of you who don't know, was the second wife of Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey was the co-founder, I should say, of an organization called the Universal Negro Improvement Association that he actually started in Jamaica. So in many ways, talking about Amy Jacques Garvey is a way to talk about a diasporic Blackness in that, she was raised in Jamaica, came to the United States, traveled to Ghana, went back to Jamaica, and basically had this diasporic experience where she was able to take her life and her willingness to understand beyond who she was. And she was an elite Jamaican who came to the United States, joined a movement that was really bent on what Marcus Garvey described as Africa for the Africans. That is, how can Africa be a place that it doesn't matter where you might have been scattered to because of the transatlantic slave trade, but that is your homeland. And how can you understand a connection to it? And if you understand your connection to it, you won't see yourself as a minority in America or in London or in Amsterdam. You will see yourself a part of a global majority because you will see yourself connected to Africa. So Amy Jacques Garvey, the second wife, was a dutiful wife. That is, she supported her husband, but she also expanded how Black women could experience the organization. And she was the editor of a page in their newspaper, the Negro World, called Our Women and What They Think. Our women and what they think. And I love that. Not what they do, but what they think. And so she basically created this column where women could write about what they were thinking about their lives, about their society, about their children, about their husbands and fathers about their communities. And it's important because as thinkers, they also began to theorize. That means they were trying to figure out how can we name concepts? How can we name the complexity of our lives so that it's understood as a fluidity and not a contradiction? That is, that one could support their husband and still support their own personal visions for who they are. And so, in many ways, she, as a writer and a thinker, and one who brought in the thoughts of other Black women throughout the diaspora. And I want to underscore the diaspora because the Negro world understood that not all Black people outside of Africa had English as their first language. So they had a column that was printed in French. They had a column that was printed in Spanish, again, underscoring the diasporic nature of Blackness and where Black people could find themselves in the world. They had these columns printed in Spanish and English in order to expand the organization outside of the Anglo-Saxon world, if you will, and also to connect with Black people no matter where they might have been. And so this was crucial for Amy Jacques Garvey. And so in this book, I coined this concept called community feminism, as a way in which to understand how could she, as a woman, be a helpmate to Marcus Garvey. And at the same time, when she's in the community, figure out how could women have more options and choices in their life outside of traditional understandings of being a wife and being a mother. And so community feminism was something that I coined as a way in which to understand the 1920s Black intellectual woman who understood herself in relationship to her family and her husband, but also in relationship to her community.
And this is very impressive because we have to see she lived between 1895 and she passed away in 1973. So this was a time where most of all the feminist movements around the world, not just about Africa, were still in the inception. So she was a fantastic, iconic personality. Thank you for that. And it's a really fantastic research. So you, as a professor of the UC Berkeley, you are honored with Distinguished Professor Teaching Award. And teaching is something very dear to me. And at the moment, it's probably more important than ever, especially with AI taking over a lot of things and as well redesigning the way we learn. And for instance, I was talking recently with a thought leader friend of mine, and she was telling me that at the moment you're going to have pre-digital education, then you're going to have after digital education, and now we're going to have pre-AI education and after AI education. So we're going to have a lot of silos in terms of this. So we have the silos of race, the silos of controversial parts of humanity, and we have as well right now how this brings into technology and all the different areas. So what is your approach to teaching, bearing in mind all these different things, and especially with the difficult and very important subjects of as well looking at the Afro-American history and feminism, but as well integrating this with young generations that are having much more challenge, or at least not much, different kind of challenges?
I love your question around AI, and it's something that as a teacher, I am really, really learning to work with, because in the beginning, I was working against it. And so let me give you the example why I was working against it. So I teach a summer course on the modern civil rights movement, wherein we talk about the Montgomery bus boycott, Martin Luther King, Ella Baker, Malcolm X. And this course is 100% online. And so all of the exams are online. And so with the final exam, my folks who I work with, the teaching assistants, were saying, Eula, everyone's getting the same response for this question. I'm like, what? And it was a very, basic question grounded in their reading, but people use Chat GPT to answer it. And so I didn't know what to do because I didn't have anything on my syllabus that said if you cannot use Chat GPT. Um, and so, but I also felt that there was some cheating happening because everyone had the same answer. And so I didn't want to accuse anyone, but I wanted to hold people accountable. So I sent out an email. So I have 200 people in this class. And I sent out an email. I said, it's come to my attention that some of you have used Chat GPT in this answer. And more than likely, you have used it all summer. I don't want to accuse any of you of cheating, but I'm going to give you until 5 p.m. to confess using this platform. Rolling confessions started coming in. People who we had not even thought had participated in using AI began to confess. It was in the confession that I really began to rethink not only my teaching, but how to use AI in a way where students would use it critically. So in the confessions, many of them were saying, I know I should not have been using this in other platforms. I know it was against, academic integrity, but I was feeling overwhelmed. I was working, I had an internship. I needed this class to graduate. So all of the pressures of being a student really came forth. And I had to sit with that because as professors, we think that our class is the most important thing in the world. So how can you not also engage it in that way? And so it was at that point I said, I need to rethink this. And I knew I couldn't rethink it on my own. I am a technological dinosaur. I still have a flip phone. I have never texted. So what am I going to do with all of this new technology? So I contacted a person on campus who helped me redesign my course. And I redesigned it by so for each section, there are 4 questions. And so now the first question in each section has an answer that comes directly from Chat GPT. So for example, the question might be, provide a definition of the Montgomery bus boycott, where Martin Luther King participated in this nonviolent direct action movement. That might be a question. Then the answer that comes from Chat GPT is embedded in it. The students are asked to critique the answer. What is correct about this? What is incorrect about this? What's missing from this? So it's a way for them to understand, yes, there is some good information, but there's some other information that's not correct. There's some missing loopholes in this. And so my hope is after critiquing it, if they continue to use it, they will also critique what they see.
Oh, that's very special, and I think this is one thing. This opens another question that I want to touch is one of the challenge with, especially, and of course you are in one of the universities that is one of the leading in the world, but the challenge we're facing right now, independent of the AI divide and digital divide, that is as well how these big artificial intelligence large language models pick materials from researchers like you and others and integrate it in their big models. And in some cases, for instance, there was a study I interviewed actually here, one of the directors of UNESCO. And one of the challenge that he was saying, he was actually director of UNESCO for advanced education, is that a lot of these models are picking a lot of things in the internet. And there's a lot of hate in the internet. There's a lot of hate provoked by different things. Sometimes it's frustration. Sometimes are people that you want to provoke. But unfortunately, you can pick the best and the worst of humanity. So I'm sure that when you did that research, did you try as well? Because one of the challenges right now in terms of AI is the gender bias and all the different parts that it touches, not gender bias, but as well race issues that are picking, because some of the models are picking things from the internet or picking things from Wikipedia, and all of this gets in a lot of different ways. But at the same time, at least the best models are being trying to pick the research from the top universities. So how do you see this? And I know that it's outside of your scope of work, but it's important because it is your scope of work as an authority in the areas of that we are talking here.
Well, in my effort to try to understand it, I was told that the vocabulary that I was given was that it scrapes the internet for information, but it doesn't analyze it and it doesn't critique it. And so one of the things I've been thinking more and more about, I remember when I was a young professor, when Wikipedia was new on the block. And I remember I told my students, you cannot use Wikipedia as a source. You cannot cite Wikipedia. Who are the people that are creating the narratives for Wikipedia? And now I have to confess, when I want to get some basic information and be introduced to something, I go to Wikipedia. So in many ways, I see perhaps all of these different AI platforms as an early version of Wikipedia. And it's going to require human beings to make it better. It's going to require people who are experts in fields to make it better. So one of the things I love about Wikipedia, usually if it's a slim offering or they want more insight into it, they will say, we need your help. They will say, can you help us fill out this description? Can you help us provide a more solid definition? And this is why I think Wikipedia now has advanced to being, a go-to introductory source for something. And usually the list of the bibliography is so important because it takes you to other ways of thinking about whatever you went to go and learn. So I was thinking about how in certain classes at UC Berkeley, they have an element around the Wikipedia where the professor goes in and assigns particular aspects, ideas, themes, people, where students are charged with going in and making it better, cleaning it up, making it a more solid intellectual academic source. And so I know this is a part of some teaching at UC Berkeley. And I'm not quite sure how we can translate or map that onto different kind of AI programs. But if we could do that, I think that AI and ChatGPT could definitely shake loose of some of these biases around race, around gender, around class. And I think that's important for us to do if we are going to because it's here. So how are we going to utilize it in a way that's beneficial and not detrimental to the academy?
100%. And I think I love the way you pick the Wikipedia, because initially, yes, there was a lot of issues and now became actually one of the biggest sources for everything. And it's actually, I think, in terms of at least the scientific studies around that, is that the quality of research is actually one of the best in the world. And of course, a lot of academics are there. So, and it's important as, of course, I'm very involved in AI. I think what your level of expertise and your research is more important to integrate that. And I like as well what you touched, putting the level of interaction and creating open models and open AI models that you can learn with that. So very good point, and I highlight this as well, even in some of my work, and as well talking with other researchers and creators. So, looking ahead, we have quite a lot of we have gone a lot, especially in the last 100 years, and you have a lot of research in a lot of areas that you touch, and we've been touching here. So, what do you think is the next big question or questions or challenges in the African American history that scholars and researchers need to tackle? And as well, we touched a bit this before, but I always like to do is how can we shape this in the future in your field, but as well bringing this to first of all, to get the research, like you said, with solid basis, but as well expanding and augmenting to bigger audiences, and as well for people that need to study and learn this.
I think one of the biggest areas needed in terms of Black studies is doing more work around the rural South. We have a lot of insight and information on the North, the West, and Southern cities, but we don't have as much research about the rural South. There are Black people who did not leave, who did not migrate to Southern cities, who did not migrate from Mississippi to Chicago or from Louisiana to Los Angeles like my family. There are Black people who stayed in the rural South generations. And in many ways, their history has not received the kind of care and insight that it deserves. I think another area of Black studies that is lacking, that we have to do more around, is the diaspora, the Black diaspora in the United States. I think more of us are going to have to be more multilingual. We're going to have to be able to speak and read documents, not just speak, but read documents in Spanish and Old Spanish and French. In order to understand the overlapping diasporas, right? How people come from one place and then they overlap with people coming from other places. And what does that overlapping diaspora do for Black communities? What does that overlapping diaspora do for Black studies? So in many ways, I think the rural South, where Black people continue to work the land for themselves, where they engage in subsistence farming, where many of them don't have access to a quick internet line, where they have to go in town to a local library to have access to the internet. These people are incredibly important to the history and culture of Black studies in America, and their stories need to be represented more.
Yeah, it's a key element. So another question related with this, but a bit to around the debates around race, equality, and history that are so prominent at the moment. What role do you think African American history and Black feminist theory, and I would like if you could define from an academic perspective both. I think it's important to, although we're not an academy, I am as well an academic, I respect that. And what should they play in the public discourse today?
Mm-hmm. Black studies is so important in the public discourse today because Black studies is an interdisciplinary field. And that means that people who do history, like myself, people who do geography, people who do literature, people who do linguistics, people who do sociology, people who do health, are all interested in how we can bring together multi-disciplines into a field to understand the world that we live in. And I think one of the reasons why Black studies as a field is under attack is because of the progress that we have made. That is, now at most universities, If you go to a geography department, if you go to an English department, if you go to a sociology department, there is someone who also engages in Black studies in those departments. Because Black studies as a field has helped to create a critical transformation of the academy and in ways that disrupts the boundaries and silos of learning. So, in order to understand what one might experience in a southern city or in a northern environment, one has to engage in the movement of Black people, whether they are moving from the South to the North or if they're moving from the Caribbean to New York City. And I think this is why there has been so much pushback is because of the progress. But I think it's important to understand that progress does not dismantle fairness. Progress does not chip away at a more democratic society. In fact, it helps to create it. And so I think that there are so many ways that fairness and progress is being wrapped around and misunderstood as discriminating against white people, particularly elite white people, when that's not the case. It is a sleight of hand when we need to think about can we create this multiracial and multilinguistic democracy?
Yeah, it's a key element, but it's quite complex because of our dynamics, and that's what makes humanity so special but so complex. So one of your books that is from 2018 is The Patriarchal Structure of the Nation of Islam. And so I would like to touch that because it's quite interesting because you have both the Afro history, but as well this part which goes broader to pick a topic that is actually there's 1 billion people at least that are identifying Islam, and of course there's a lot of, first of all, patriarchy is a very sensitive topic. And even me, I try as a father of a daughter and as well as a person that wants to learn. So I want to touch this from your book research, but as well from a broader topic of patriarchy, feminism, and how we can actually get this right. And I'm talking for myself as well as someone that wants to learn, but I would like as well for our audience to enlarge their views, but as well look at history and research and identify.
Well, first of all, congratulations to you for trying to get it right. Okay, it begins with us first, right? And so this book, The Promise of Patriarchy, Women in the Nation of Islam, came to me out of the classroom. And I was talking to students and I asked them, why would anybody join the original Nation of Islam after the assassination of Malcolm X? So, although it's a book about women, I came to it through Malcolm X. And in this book, I look at how the promise of patriarchy for African American women between 1930 and 1975, which is the original Nation of Islam, and the promise of patriarchy for Black women included that they would have the choice to stay at home and raise their children, that they would have the choice to pour into their children's education in a way where students were the center and not the white gaze, where they had the choice of feeling safe walking down the street and not being accosted. So the promise of patriarchy in many ways can be understood as Leaning into elite and middle class options and choices that women have. The option not to work outside the home, the option to raise your children. And these are options that the majority of Black women did not have because the majority of Black women are a part of the working poor. So the promise was to marry a man who could be a breadwinner. And it was very hard for Black men to be breadwinners between 1930 and 1975 because of the way in which Jim Crow operated and later other forms of racial discrimination. And so for Black men, so the promise of patriarchy is not the promise is for women, but the promise is also for men too. That if you join this organization, we're going to help you to be a breadwinner. We're going to help you to be a head of household. We're going to help you take care of your children and to be a good husband. So the promise was on both sides. The challenge around it is how can you make this promise happen wherein ideas around control and violence and silencing don't happen? So in many ways, it's walking a tightrope because if Black women are not able to stay in their house and raise their children, more than likely their option is to work as a domestic in the home of somebody else. And so, and clearly there's no guarantee that that wouldn't be a patriarchal condition as well. And so for me, I was interested, I came from the position that I have to put my Black feminist ideas on the curb and think about the options and choices of women based on where they are, particularly women who otherwise would be working as a domestic in the United States. And once I did that, I could understand how enticing that promise would be. I am a formally educated woman, so I have different kinds of options and choices than someone who is not. And so for me, the promise of patriarchy in the Nation of Islam was a way in which Black women were doing their best to figure out how can I live in this society and raise my children and educate my children in a way where they can be their best selves. How can I live in a society where perhaps I'll have a little bit of time for myself? How about that? To do something that's empowering for me. And it was very difficult to meet the promise, given the conditions, the working conditions of Black life in the United States.
Yeah, it's really very special and it's really very important because we can only understand the complexity when we study and you go deep in what you just said. And I think for me in particular, because I have as well multiple cultures, when you are in multiple cultures, you don't understand the nuances. And these nuances are really super impactful, even for her to have a view of the world and to understand and as well to get, and as well to avoid the bias and a lot of the issues that come with this, and as well to make sure new generations can have a better capacity. So my last question, and I want to be respectful to your time. So it's estimated that the Black or African population globally makes up around 14% of the world total population. And this includes individuals of African descent from various countries worldwide. And in the United States is around 14.6 and around 45.76 million people. This is data from Statista. And the one thing that I realized as well is that I've been working a lot with Africa, and I'm very passionate. For instance, Africa is the youngest population in the world, with approximately 60% of its population under 25 years old. So that means the majority of the African population falls within the 0 to 24 age group. which is the medium of Africa is around 19 years. So we have a huge young population, and these numbers are going to be, of course, doubling because as they get children and so forth. So there's a lot of importance that we have to do in terms of education. And I know that education is very special for you. So how do you advise this young population and the young people that want to pursue a study, they want to study their identity, and as well people that want to look at African American studies or Black feminist theories, but in general, education, and they can actually get this identity to create a better world that can actually mitigate a lot of the problems that we see in history?
I would advise young people to read everything they can get their hands on, to be voracious readers, and not just read about themselves. I think that one of the most important things that I did as I was a student, I read a lot of Black history and culture, but I read a lot about a lot of other things. I read physics. I read about, oh my goodness, literature. I read when I was sitting on the bus, I would read the advertisements that were above my head. Read everything and to keep a little notebook. I think one of the things that I wish I would have been consistent with, I had them, but I was never consistent, is to keep a journal, write your thoughts, write how you're understanding your world in this moment. As you read, write vocabulary words that are new for you and try to make them a part of your language, your vocabulary, to expand it. I think there is no substituting reading, and to read everything you could get your hands on, and to also practice writing in a way that you can hear your own voice. That is, oftentimes when you read a lot of things, you want to soon replicate the voice and the cadence and the sound of your favorite author because they're your favorite. So why wouldn't you want to do that? But as you do that, begin to become in tune with your own voice, your own passion, and recognize that it has value and worth. And I'm hoping, particularly for the international folks, particularly for all of those young people on the continent, I am trying to raise money for international students to come and learn at UC Berkeley because we want to learn from you just the way in which you want to learn from us. And if you also remember that everyone around us, whether they are formally educated or not, whether they are cleaning your classroom, making your food in the cafeteria, or standing in front of you in the classroom, we all have intellectual value. And if you can recognize that, I think you will definitely be on your way to being the human being that you want to be.
That's a beautiful, inspiring, and very important for all of us, especially for these young populations, for everyone listening to us. It's been an honor to have you here, Professor Ulla. So we're going to put links to your research, to your books, and people can actually interact as well with your social media, whatever you are more visible. I learned a lot in this 1 hour plus that we've been here, and I think I have to research much more. Thank you so much for all the inspiration and as well for the lesson.
Thank you for having me. It was a joy.